Hello, I'm Anthony. Today we're going to take a look at a couple of concepts from music theory that have confusing and potentially intimidating terms, but in fact they're not scary at all and really useful on a day-to-day basis when we're writing music. Those concepts are harmonic function and cadence. A couple of terms you might have come across many times and not really understood exactly what we're talking about when we use them. So with a few very simple examples today, I'm going to demonstrate those two principles and hopefully illustrate how useful they are when we're actually writing music. Okay, let's make a start. I'm going to play a single chord, and the chord is G7. G, B, D, F. On its own, that chord has no function. What do I mean by that? Well, a function is what does the chord want you to hear next? What's its role in the piece of music? As a standalone entity, chords can't possibly have any function because they're not doing anything. They're simply existing in isolation. But of course, that's not how music works. What's actually going to happen is that we're going to hear a chord after it. The chord after it is then going to retrospectively define what the first chord's function is. Now, the chord that I just played is a very important chord because of all of the standalone chords in Western music, that chord has the strongest implied next chord. In other words, it has a very powerful function. What it's pretty much insisting that happens, your brain is probably screaming what the next sequence of notes needs to be. From here, you want to hear that. That's a C major chord. What's just happened there is that the G7 has served a function that's leading you to the next set of notes, the next chord. Now that function is the most important of all musical functions in Western music, and it's called a dominant function. It's so important that it actually imposes its name, the function imposes its name on the chord itself, rather than this being called G7, which from a theory perspective it is, we actually call it a G dominant 7. This is one of the very rare occasions when harmonic function imposes itself upon musical theory. And the job that that chord is doing is so vital, it's so central to basically everything that we do, that it imposes its name on the chord itself. There's no reason why that word dominant needs to be there. G7 describes it perfectly, but it's actually a G dominant 7, that's what we call it. So the dominant function is something that gets you back to your tonic. We've actually reverse engineered what key we're in by figuring out that we needed to finish up on a C major. We now know that we're in the key of C major. That chord, the first chord, has actually determined the key of the entire song. Now, in the context of the piece of music that you're writing, a chord could serve many different functions. The dominant function is the most important and the central concept of Western music. But the more you learn about harmonic function, the more you understand how one chord relates to another. It's all about the relationship between these two chords. And before we move on to have a look at another kind of function, I want to bring in the second of those terms I wanted to talk about, which is the term cadence. Because there are two different perspectives from which we can consider those two chords. Firstly, we have the G7 serving a dominant function, leading us back to the tonic. I've actually played that C major chord as an inversion now. Can you see that the G is the lowest note? It's still a C major, but I've used voice leading there to minimize the movement between one chord and another. And it just kind of makes it more satisfying. We're not talking about voice leading today, but if you notice that my C major chord is played slightly differently, I'm just using very simple voice leading to make that chord sound pleasant. So anyway, the word dominant is used to describe the function, the relationship between those two chords. But there's also a movement relationship to be discussed because there's a flow between those two chords, and that flow is the cadence. Now, the word cadence derives from the Latin word cadere, which means fall, and it describes the flow or movement of one chord into another. The flow of this chord into this chord is called perfect. That's a perfect cadence. because it's the most satisfying to our ears. For hundreds of years, every classical piece of music that you heard finished off with a perfect cadence, and people were very unhappy if they didn't hear it, because it's so fundamentally kind of resonant with our brains. We understand this stuff on a deep intrinsic level because we're actually in tune with the harmonic series. You know, the universe has this really simple mathematical set of rules, and we understand them for reasons that we don't understand. We don't really know why we latch onto this stuff, but we know that we do, which is why music is such a universal language. So we're using these fancy technical terms to describe these different elements of the music. And when we talk about a cadence, we're talking about the flow of one set of notes into another. Let's introduce a third chord now. I'm going to play the chord F major 7. F-A-C-E. So listen to that chord in isolation. It doesn't quite have the same compulsion that the G7 chord had. When we heard the G7, we intrinsically felt like it needed to go somewhere, and we kind of knew where it needed to go. That's not really the same with F major 7. It has a tense quality to it, and that's largely because the upper and lower notes are actually one semitone apart. You have to be very careful how you play an F major 7. If I drop this E down an octave, suddenly it's dissonant because those two notes are right next to each other. So it's a tricky chord to voice. You need to make sure that you play the right notes. All notes are not equal, even if they're called the same thing. So here's my F major 7. All on its own, what's it doing? Well, obviously nothing. It has no function at the moment. Only the next thing that we do afterwards is going to ascribe that function to it. So let's go down two different paths and use that F major 7 in two different concepts. Here's the first pattern. Now, hopefully at that point, your brain is once again screaming resolution. After the second chord, which is the G7 we've already looked at, you need to go home. You need to hear that tonic chord. And so we get there from the F major 7. The F major 7 is now performing a function. It's just assumed the role of subdominant. It's assumed a function. The F major 7 is now subdominant, the G7 is dominant, and the tonic is home. Let's have a quick look at the term subdominant. It's interesting in its own right from a historical perspective. Let's start off from the tonic chord. There's your C major. The relationship of the dominant to that chord is that it's 7 semitones higher. The root of the dominant chord is 7 semitones higher than the tonic. The root of the subdominant is 7 semitones below the tonic. So dominant above, subdominant below. But they're both separated from the tonic, the root note, by 7 semitones. When you add those three chords together, you've got every note of the scale. C, E, G from the tonic chord. We add B and D when we play the G major. And we add F and A when we play the F major. So with just three chords, we've defined the entire scale. And those three chords in classical harmonic theory are the most important chords of the scale: the tonic, dominant, and subdominant. Everything else is subservient to those three chords. They're considered the anchor of all Western music. Okay, so having clarified the definition of subdominant, let's have a look at it back in a functioning context. Here's your F major 7, serving as the subdominant to the second most important chord, which then leads us back to the most important chord, the tonic. Now we're going to take a different journey. Starting with the F major 7 again, we're going to take a much simpler route. We're going to go straight to the tonic without playing that intervening chord. Again, I've inverted the C major, but I am playing a simple C major. All I've done there is I've thrown away the two notes of the F major 7 underneath, substituted a G. Now I'm playing a simple C major chord. The F major 7 still has the same function. It's a subdominant, but this time it's no longer passing through the dominant, it's going directly to the tonic. When you play a 4 chord directly into a 1, that chord sequence has its own cadence. The name of that cadence is plagal. The plagal cadence, also known as the Amen cadence, is very popular in church music, and it's softer, it's more gentle than the dominant cadence, which is very imposing and powerful. If we consider the two together, here's dominant. It's got pomp and vigour and kind of oomph about it. The plagal cadence is much softer. It makes you feel like you want to play the keyboard differently. Something to bear in mind when you're considering theory is that theory is always subservient to observed reality. We hear this stuff, we know that it's beautiful before we give it a title, and then we use theory after the fact to assign labels to these concepts so that we can use them more generally, and we can teach this stuff to students. We don't want to learn the entire canon of musical theory from first principles. We want to be able to learn these convenient things, and if we give them labels, it just helps us to identify what we're doing. But the most important thing is that we hear the beauty between these different intervals. And it's no coincidence that so much religious music uses the plagal cadence. For our final example today, we're going to have a look at an example of a function where we use notes not in the scale. So we're still in the key of C major here, we're using all of the white keys. But the chord that I'm going to introduce for this example is C dominant 7, C, E, G, B flat. That B flat has no place in this scale. I'm going to find a way to fit it into the scale to make it sound interesting in a musical context. The full chord sequence looks like this. We start off with a G7. Then I'm going to play a C dominant 7. Second inversion, doesn't matter. The notes are still the same. F major 7. Down to C major. So how am I getting away with introducing that B flat in the C dominant 7? Well, it's all about function. That C7 is followed immediately by an F major 7. Just consider for a moment that we modulate temporarily in the middle of this chord sequence into the key of F. F major 7 is the tonic, the root chord of F major. Now have a think about what the 5th chord is with respect to the key of F major. Well, 7 semitones up from F gets you to C, and the 5 chord in a major key is a dominant 7 chord. So those are the notes of C dominant 7, that's the 5th chord of F major. So in my chord sequence I started out playing a G dominant 7, but then I shifted to a chord not in the scale of C major, the C dominant 7, implying that that chord was now fulfilling a new role. It's a dominant chord with respect to a different root, not the primary root of C major, which is our main key, but the secondary root of the chord that we're travelling towards, which is F. And here's the fascinating thing about that 4th note that we introduced to the C chord. If I'd just played a triad, if I'd played a C major chord, then we haven't modulated anywhere, we haven't done anything unusual at all. That chord sequence with a C major, G dominant 7 to C major to F major 7, back to C major again, the entire thing remains in the key of C major. It sounds like it is, and that middle C chord in the second chord of the phrase, it actually sounds a little bit odd. It's like you've gone back home and then you've gone somewhere else and then you've come back home again. It's only when we introduce the 4th note, making the chord function ambiguous, because B flat has no place in the key, that it kind of encourages our brain to think about those notes in a new way. In other words, to think about them serving a new function. We're kind of feeling around trying to find out what that function is when the composer tells us what the function is. by playing an F major 7 and we think, oh, it's dominant, it's a dominant chord with respect to the chord that comes after it. Now we're listening to F major 7. We're kind of in a pseudo world here where we're not entirely sure whether or not we're still in the key of C major that we have been in up until now. We might be 2 minutes into the song and we haven't modulated anywhere. This is the first time we've gone somewhere new. And so we have new sonic possibilities. Have we permanently shifted to the key of F major? And are we going to stay there now forever? Well, the answer is no, because immediately following this chord, we resolve back to C major and we're back home again. So you can consider it as if we've temporarily shifted to a new key. But in reality, that's not actually how theory explains what's happened here. When you play a secondary dominant like that C dominant 7 was, that's a non-modulating context. In other words, it's a chord specifically designed to serve the function of the following chord. And so we call this a non-modulating context. We haven't shifted to a new key. We're still fully planted in the original root key, C major, and we emphasize that fact very quickly by finally resolving back to the root chord. Now, the subject of secondary chords is fascinating in its own right, but I thought I'd introduce it to this discussion to give you a kind of an insight into the role of harmonic function. If you play a 2-chord sequence and they're separated by 7 semitones, then you need to strongly consider the possibility that that first chord is serving a dominant function. And the perfect cadence that the dominant function serves when resolving to a root sounds so strong that it works in almost every context. You'll be amazed at how often you can put a dominant major chord, a dominant 7th chord, 7 semitones above any chord that you're heading towards, and it will almost always sound good. It's incredible how strong that chord is. And that'll do us for today. Hope you enjoyed the video. Please hit like if you did. Don't forget to subscribe if you'd like to see more of these videos. I'll see you again. Thanks a lot.